Okay, here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through what we talked about the last couple of days is sort of how the Constitution is developed, right? Like the Constitutional Convention, and then what preceded it as far as the Articles of Confederation, and then Madison's attempt to defend it, and the things that he thought about and anticipated, and the problems, and so on and so forth. I will be honest with you, the first unit of AP Gov, I'm doing whoever replaces me a favor because it is not the most exciting. It's probably the driest of the units, but you've got to get these, you've got to go ahead and have these bones before you can start layering flesh on it. So that's what we're doing right now. So as far as the actual text of the Constitution, here's what I want to go ahead and explain. Our checks and balances is probably one of the most fundamental elements of the Constitution. We'll actually come back to that at the end, but that's one thing that Madison threw in. Another thing that he threw in, and I want you to understand this, is he wanted it to be absolutely clear what the federal government could and could not do. There was to be no mystery about it. Remember, they were essentially building this incredibly strong, incredibly centralized federal government and handing it to a country that had just fought a revolution to get away from an incredibly strong and incredibly centralized government. So what they thought to themselves is, we have got to go ahead and tie the federal government's hands in such a way as to make sure that nobody is scared, nobody is anxious, nobody is nervous, that the federal government is going to become tyrannical in any way, right? That it's going to stomp on the rights of the people or stomp on the rights of the states. And so what he does is Madison's like, look, I will make it very clear precisely what the federal government can do. And beyond that, remember that if it is not listed specifically as a power of the federal government, based off what we talked about last time, do you remember whose power it defaults to? Throw it in the chat if you do. All those powers, yep, all those powers, good. All those powers not specifically delegated to the federal government are reserved for the state. So what powers are they? The list is actually called the Enumerated Powers. You can see here, Article 1, Section 8 discusses precisely what the federal government can do. And by that, I mean specifically what Congress can do, because that is actually the bulk of the federal government. If you ever look at the actual Constitution, and I'm sure you will, but if you ever flip through the actual Constitution, Article 1 covers Congress. Article 2 covers the president, and then Article 3 covers the judiciary, right? Between those three, Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3, you can almost see the Founding Fathers like prioritizing which one they feel is first most important, second most important, and third most important. And I will tell you, the judiciary, they almost just sort of like pish-posh, like write it off, like it's of no concern to them. There's like 2 paragraphs on the judicial branch, whereas there are 2 pages basically written about what the Congress can do and about 1 page about what the executive branch can do. But their primary focus was on Congress, the legislative branch. And that's who they give a list of enumerated powers to. And I say enumerated because they are numbered off actually in the Constitution. I believe there are like 14 of them. You'll never need to know how many, but that's it. Usually just about more than a dozen. And it's stuff like, I'm going to throw it in the chat for you. It's stuff like declare war. Congress can declare war, right? It's stuff like manage the post offices. That's something that Congress can go ahead and do. Levy taxes. That is something that Congress can go ahead and do. Create a system of weights and measures, right, that will apply nationally, right, which is why we still use the standard system of, you know, feet and miles and whatnot, whereas the rest of the country or the rest of the world has shifted to metric. But Congress makes all of these decisions. They can go ahead and fund an army and a navy, right? That's a thing that they can do. And you'll never have to have these memorized. But it's again, about a dozen of these powers that the federal government can wield. Now, the thing is, one of these, another one, which is relatively important, is actually you can see it down here, is the ability to regulate commerce amongst the several states. That clause or that sentence is actually referred to as the Commerce Clause. And of all the powers that the federal government can wield, of all the enumerated powers, that is the one that has probably been the most open to interpretation. In other words, it's got the most flexibility is what I'm telling you. If you look at, for instance, like the ability to declare war. Like that's yeah, it's a little flexible, I suppose, if you look at like military conflicts like Vietnam and such, where war was never declared. But really, the ability to declare war is just that. You can declare war. The ability to go ahead and manage the post offices, there's no really broad way of interpreting that, right? Like that is what it says that it is. However, commerce, like how would you define commerce? Like what is another word you can use for commerce? Somebody throw in chat. Yeah, trade's good. But the simple fact that it took, 5 minutes for two of you to go ahead and come up with a synonym for it means that there is some give and take with how broadly you can interpret that phrase, right? Or I'm sorry, that word, commerce. So you're referring to basically business that occurs between the states. And I will tell you very specifically, it is interstate commerce that can be regulated. And so the reason why I talk to you about how flexible it is and how stretchable that particular word is because there is one last sentence at the very end of the list of like 14 enumerated powers. There is a sentence that basically, you can see it there under B, where it says Congress, in addition to having the ability to declare war and regulate commerce and fund an army and a navy and create a system of weights and measures and issue patents and fight piracy and all the things that it has one last, you tell me what, I'm putting in the chat now just to make sure that everybody gets it. Sorry, I typed slowly. Okay, that's the last one. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And so they're like, what do you think is problematic about that particular sentence, especially to a bunch of people sitting in a room who are paranoid about big government, who are paranoid about government taking control? Madison promised them. He's like, no, I got this, guys. I got this. These are the very specific things that they can do. And then you're hit with this sentence at the end. And so like, wait, Madison, wait. What can the federal government do? He's like, declare war. And they're like, what else? He's like, levy taxes. And they're like, what else? He's like, everything. And they're like, what? He's like, no, everything. And so that sentence is way too flexible. It goes ahead and grants way too much flexibility to the federal government for the comfort of some of the anti-federalists in the room. They're like, whoa, hold the phone. This is not what we agreed to. You can't have like, they can do this, and also other. What is other? That's a giant gaping hole. In fact, actually, people hate this sentence so much that it is immediately sort of maligned and insulted and given a nickname by the anti-federalists in the room, because they essentially say what this does is it lets the federal government stretch its powers into infinity. And so what, of course, is the nickname for this particular clause? You probably learned about it in history class last year. Elastic clause, yes. The elastic clause, because it is an anti-federalist hated this. And actually Brutus #1, which I told you about last time, Brutus #1 like rips into this particular concept. It rips into the concept of the elastic clause. And so, but Madison's like, look, I have to explain that to you like this. First of all, it is not just entirely a get out of free card, right? It does not just allow us to do whatever we want. What it allows them to do is to stretch the already existing powers out. In other words, it doesn't allow us to create new powers, but it allows us to essentially stretch pre-existing powers in order to get things done. And the anti-federalists still aren't satisfied. They're like, come on. He's like, no. He's like, guys, you have to hear me out. Here we sit in 1787. Without a crystal ball, without any knowledge of what the country is going to be like in the future. Who knows what the country is going to go through? He's like, I don't think we should lock in the federal government to a very precise series of powers without knowing and without future-proofing the document. Like, because we have no idea what's going to happen in subsequent generations. They may have to deal with things that we can't even imagine. And spoilers, we have. And so he said, I need to be able to give them some flexibility to do things that are beyond what we could possibly expect now. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. If it doesn't, throw it into the chat and I will go ahead and elaborate on it. And I will tell you that there is still some grumbling, but Madison is right. I mean, you can't just lock a country down into the goings-ons of 1787 and expect that everything's just going to stay the same. He needed to go ahead and give them flexibility, and so he does. I will give you an example. Excuse me. I will give you an example of how the elastic clause has actually been relevant in the past. You can, if you're writing these down, you can stop for a second and just hear this story because it's pretty memorable. I suspect you'll be able to get it down later, but I want you to hear and understand this because it is perfect fodder for an FRQ or something if you need that. All right, so here's the gist. Basically what happened was, let's take segregation. Okay, so you jump into the 1960s, right? And the federal government wants to go ahead and end segregation. Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, and they want to go ahead and tell the country, look, businesses cannot deny service to African Americans, right? You can't have like a diner where they can say like, we only serve whites because that's racist and it's wrong. And frankly, we don't want our country doing that anymore. So a bunch of congressmen get together in the 60s and they draft the 1964 Civil Rights Act and they say private businesses shall no longer be able to segregate. Okay, cool, right? So basically what happens though is that a bunch of people decide that they still want to segregate. And specifically, they want to go ahead and be able to not be told by the federal government that they can't. Well, long story short, there is nothing in the enumerated powers about civil rights. There's nothing that was originally written. So basically, what they have to do is the federal government has to think of a way to go ahead and justify, to think of a way to stretch one of the enumerated powers using the elastic clause in order to justify the existence of anti-segregation laws. You following me so far? Okay, so here's basically what happens. There is a motel proprietor in Atlanta, Georgia, right? Who is like, I'm not going to go ahead and desegregate. My hotel is going to go ahead and cater only to whites, right? So that it's called the Heart of Atlanta Motel, right? And so the federal government cannot like allow business owners to just like completely flaunt federal law, right? They can't allow them to just not go ahead and not, they can't allow them to keep segregation in place. So they sue him, right? Or they levy a fine against his establishment, and because he's breaking the law. And so he goes and he actually fights it in court, and he fights it all the way to the Supreme Court because his rationale is that he does not get to go ahead and be told by the federal government how to run his personal business. And the federal government is like, oh, yes, we do. Oh, yes, we do. Because of what clause, ladies and gentlemen? What clause allows the federal government to tell him how he can run his hotel? What clause is going to be stretched? The one I told you, the enumerated power I told you was most flexible. Well, the elastic clause can be applied to this other clause. Like what are they applying the elastic clause to? Because that's the way the elastic clause works. It only works in tandem or in association with another sentence. So what is the sentence? There we go, Hannah. Yes, the commerce clause, right? So they're like, oh, sir, perhaps you don't understand. We can tell you whether or not you're going to segregate, and we can tell you whether or not who your hotel can and cannot serve, because we control commerce. And he's like, wait, what kind of commerce? And so what is the answer to that? What kind of commerce can they regulate? In-state or interstate? Nobody wants to commit. Oh, Hannah does. Hannah, man, you're 3 for 3. Thank you, Emma, also. Yes, they can regulate interstate commerce, right? So anything that crosses state lines. And so the proprietor of the hotel was like, well, my business doesn't cross state lines. They're like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I'm not a chain. He's like, I am not a chain of hotels. What I am is I am a proprietor of a single hotel. It's like a bed and breakfast, really, frankly. He's like, I'm a proprietor of a single hotel. Like we get all of our food here. All of our employees are in state. I do all of my accounting within the state of Georgia. So he's like, none of my business ever crosses state lines. So you are attempting to reach into the state of Georgia and control Georgia's commerce. And he's like, and that is blatantly unconstitutional. He's like, you cannot tell me how to run my business when I do not go ahead and perpetrate interstate commerce. I just go ahead and function as an in-state business. Well, the federal government is sort of screwed here because he's technically right, but they can't just let it go, right? If they let this guy go, then you're going to have all sorts of businesses throughout the South that are coming up with this same rationale, right? That are coming up and saying, well, fine, we will also go ahead and deny you. We'll also go ahead and keep segregation in place. So Ashlyn asked, so is the, okay, hold on, Ashlyn, let me get back to that in 2 seconds. So basically, here's the thing. The lawyers for the federal government, they gather up, like they scramble, and they've got to think of a creative way to make this guy comply using only the arrows they have in their quiver, right? Again, they cannot invent new powers. They have to find a way to make the elastic clause and the commerce clause apply to this dude in such a way as to force him to comply. So think about it for a second. Can you think of any way that you could force the interstate commerce clause to apply to this hotel owner? Because, I mean, clearly they did it, right? We don't allow segregation anymore. So clearly the federal government won this one. So spoilers, you already know they thought of something. But I guarantee you their lawyers were scrambling. How is it that they get to go ahead and apply the interstate commerce clause to a purely in-state business? Emma says, have people from out of state go there? They don't even have to rig it, Emma, but you are correct. It's a hotel. So where are the customers from? All of his goods may be from in the state of Georgia. All of his employees may be from the state of Georgia. But yes, hotels cater to people from out of state, right? There's no way that hotel owner can guarantee that his customers, there's no way that hotel owner can guarantee that his customers are all from the in-state of Georgia. So they're like, hey, can we see your guest book? And so they subpoena the guy's guest book. He's like, wait, why? And they're like, no reason. We just want to see. And so they subpoena his guest book and they go through it. And it turns out that he has catered largely, because he's a hotel, he's catered largely to an interstate body of customers who have crossed state lines in order to go ahead and be guests at his hotel, be customers, and bring commerce, frankly, to his hotel. So the Supreme Court is like, boom, they nail the gavel down and they say, we rule in favor of the federal government. If you have any form of interstate commerce occurring within your business, then you must comply with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And everybody has something, right? Like, I mean, maybe there are one or two businesses out there that can swear up and down that they never go ahead and cater to out-of-state customers, but I would tell you that is probably extremely unlikely. So nobody fights anymore. Everyone just sort of complies, and that is the way that it goes. So Ashlyn had asked, is the Commerce Clause the same as the Elastic Clause? No. The Commerce Clause is one of the enumerated powers that can be stretched by the Elastic Clause. I wish I had a better way to like convey this visually. Sorry, I don't have my whiteboard like what I would normally have while I'm talking to you. But think of the enumerated powers again as a, let me shut this off. Think of the enumerated powers as like a list of powers, right? Like a list of like 14 things. And think of the Elastic Clause at the bottom, right? The Elastic Clause can influence or apply to any of the previous list of powers, right? In order to amplify them, to stretch them, to make them applicable, to make them elastic, to make them applicable in any particular given situation. So commerce is just like war, weights and measures, post offices, taxes. It's just like all these other powers, right? The one that is different is the Elastic Clause. And the reason why I brought up the Commerce Clause specifically is the Elastic Clause most often is used with the Commerce Clause. That's the one they choose to apply it to because commerce is inherently stretchy, right? Like you can do more with it and you can interpret it a little bit more broadly than you would be able to go ahead and interpret, say, like weights and measures, which really doesn't seem all that open to interpretation to me. Tell me yes or no, please, if you get that. Otherwise, I will go ahead and move on. Well, frankly, I got to move on anyway, but I can always come back if you need me to. I'm running out of time. I got 7 minutes. That's the free version of Zoom for you. Okay, so thankfully, I don't need all that much more time. there's one other sentence you need to know, one other clause, and that is called the Supremacy Clause. And I can sum this one up very simply for you. All the Supremacy Clause says is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. In other words, anything that contradicts or attempts to go ahead and contradict the Constitution loses. So anything that, like, you know, the Constitution says we have free speech. If a state tries to pass a law that says we don't have free speech, well, the Constitution is going to win out over that. And that's what the Supremacy Clause says. Anything that contradicts the Constitution is an attempt to contradict the supreme law of the land. And therefore, the Constitution will ultimately emerge victorious. So there's that. Lastly, I want to leave you with the amendment process, and I've actually got a graphic for you, I believe. There we go. You do need to know the amendment process. Madison did throw in there that the Constitution could be amended. It is extremely difficult to amend the Constitution. We have only had 27 amendments in the course of our entire history. Think about how different the world is than it was in 1787. The Constitution was written with a lot of forethought, and the Elastic Clause gave it a lot of wiggle room. But, you know, you have to do things like end slavery and give women the right to vote. And to do that, no stretchiness of the Elastic Clause is going to be sufficient. So basically what they did is they have amended the Constitution. How do you amend the Constitution? Well, the standard way you can see on the screen in front of you. The most common way is to go ahead and have Congress, both halves of Congress, by the way, the House and the Senate, 2/3 of both halves of Congress need to vote to suggest an amendment, right? Like women's suffrage. Then what happens is that amendment will go to the states, and 3/4 of the state legislatures, which I think is 36 of the 50 state legislatures must vote to go ahead and ratify that amendment. So think of it like this. Congress is like, look, the federal government has an idea for a federal amendment, but states, you're the ones who are going to have to live under it. So whereas only 2/3 of Congress need to vote to suggest this amendment, they're like 3/4 of the states actually have to ratify it to make it official. We have not had a constitutional amendment since the 80s, the 1980s. It has been a while. And the one that even that one was relatively toothless. It was just about whether or not congressmen could give themselves a raise. We probably have the one prior to that, amendment number 26, was about how old you had to be federally to vote. That's the one that lowered the voting age nationwide to 18 during the Vietnam War. You probably learned about that last year in history. But as you can imagine, we've had various other amendments. But remember, the first 10 of those 27, the first 10 amendments happened right at the onset of the Constitutional Convention. Those are the Bill of Rights. So again, we have only amended the Constitution 17 times since 1789. That is an unbelievably restrained and minuscule number of times to change the federal government. And I think it just goes to show you, the fact that we had to change it so few times goes to show you how well thought out this thing was in the first place. So there it is. What I will do for you now, so I'll leave you with one last bit. If you want to screenshot this, I told you I'd come back to checks and balances, but I'm running out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and leave you with these two images. Here's the blank one showing checks and balances. Will you go ahead and screenshot that for yourself, please? Or you can always screenshot it for a friend and pass it along. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up for you the filled out version. When you are young, you learn about checks and balances as being like veto, judicial review, and like impeachment. But as you can see, there's a lot more to it than that. These are what the branches can do to one another to check and balance each other's power out. Those are the powers that they have available, the way they can go and balance one another out. If you want to screenshot that one, that'd be great. And I have about 3 minutes left on this Zoom to go ahead and answer any questions that you've got about this, if there are any words or phrases on there you see that you don't understand, or about anything else that I have talked about. Do not be shy, because I guarantee you I went quickly and not everybody understood every word. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now so that you can jump in with any questions. You can go audio if you want.